Listen up. It's time for a politically entertaining exclusive interview.
Today's guest is the author of several books such as Dear White America, White Like Me, Under the Influence. He's an anti-racist activist. Tim Wise, I want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you for making time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
I've been watching several videos on you discussing like white privilege, Donald Trump's tactics in last year's election, white supremacy. One of the videos I saw, last I checked, had like over 14 million views, and we'll definitely get into a lot of those topics you discussed. But my first question for you is, like, what made you fight this cause? Like, was there a specific action that said, you know what, this isn't right, I have to speak up, speak out? Were your parents, racist activists? What made you fight this cause like you do?
Well, I don't think it was one thing. I think, everybody that does this work, whether that person is a person of color, whether they're white, as I am, has a series of things, that happen to them over their lifetime. And for me, I think it was a combination of, and I talk about this in White Like Me, which is the first book I wrote, and it's my memoir, and I talk about it a little bit in there. I grew up in a home that was certainly civil rights oriented. I've lived in the South all my life. I grew up with, I guess, what would be considered, quote unquote, liberal or progressive parents. They were a little too young to have been actively involved in the civil rights movement itself, but they were certainly sympathetic to the movement. And at least on my father's side of the family itself was sympathetic and supportive of the movement. And so growing up with that in the 70s, I was born in 1968. I went to preschool at Tennessee State University, which, is a historically black college here in Nashville. And so, I was sort of in a peer group early on that was mostly black kids. And I'm not saying that to be like every other white person that says, oh, I got black friends, because we all say that and we're usually lying.
Right.
But for a while there, when I was a little kid, I didn't have much but black friends. That's pretty much who I hung out with. And then also, being at TSU for preschool, and I'm talking like 3 and 4 years old, 1971, 72. What I think that did for me, in addition to the peer group, which I think helped me to identify with black kids and to have this sort of connection to blackness, I suppose, in the larger social sense. But it was also, I was at a black college in their preschool program. So the teachers, the people that ran the program, the women that were the administrators of the program were mostly African-American women. So, what that meant to me at 3 and 4 years old was I was sort of learning really early, and at a time in our history as a country when this was incredibly rare. I'd say it's still rare, but certainly was in the early 70s. I was being subordinated to black authority. You're being told by your parents, hey, mind your teachers, do what they tell you to do. Well, how many white kids in the early 70s or even today are having to actually listen to black authority figures at the age of 3 and 4? Not very many. Right. And so what I think that did, and again, I talk about this in the book, was it sort of made it easier for me to hear when black folks, as I got older, would talk about what they were experiencing, because I had learned to respect black authority at the age of 3 and 4 and not to automatically question it the way I think white folks are generally in this culture. I was able to hear that. I wasn't going to be the white guy when I became an activist and an organizer, and I had black folks telling me in New Orleans, where I went to college, this is sort of what's going on. I wasn't going to be the guy that said, are you sure? Maybe you're seeing things, maybe you're exaggerating, because I didn't start with the assumption that my authority was better than theirs. And so I think that certainly had a lot to do with it, the parental upbringing. But I think it was also being in New Orleans, being around amazing activists and educators and mentors, mostly of color, also some white allies, that sort of took me and shaped me from somebody who I think, had intellectually maybe an understanding of these issues, but sort of made it more affective and emotional and personal for me. And I think the combination of those is probably what created in me a recognition of the importance of fighting racism.
That's a very unique upbringing for a young white kid. One of the videos I saw, I believe you were speaking to Google in Silicon Valley. And you was talking about how after the 2008 election of President Obama, how you got a lot of emails with people saying, oh, you're going to have to find something else to do. And One of the worst names that a black person can call another black person is an Uncle Tom or a sellout. I was wondering, before you were numb to, I'm sure, a lot of negative comments you get, in the early going, do you remember what the most stinging comment you've been called? Is there anything that sticks out to you that, before you were inundated with thousands of hate mail, the one comment that made you say, wow, that kind of stung, that hurt right there?
Well, no, not really. And I think the reason is, it's sort of like there is no racial slur that you can use against white people that is comparable to the N-word. There's also no critique of a quote unquote sellout or somebody who challenges their own group that's equal to an Uncle Tom, because Uncle Tom really, refers to somebody who's a member of an oppressed group. In this case, oppressed black folks who sell out their people. That's a very serious charge. And that's something that, furthers oppression. For a white person to stand up against white supremacy does not subject white people to oppression. So nothing that they could call me. And I've certainly been called self-hating. I've been called, there's actually in the Urban Dictionary, there is a phrase called Uncle Tim, and it was created, it was apparently created for me. This is what I'm told. I don't know. I don't know where else it would have come from. I was called the Uncle Tom of whites by Dinesh D'Souza many years ago, which is a high honor coming from him. But all of those things, I just sort of laugh at. I think they're very funny. Well, actually, they're not. They're funny at first, and ultimately they're sad. And the reason they're sad is because, unlike black folks who collaborate with white supremacy and thereby contribute to the marginalization of black people, white folks who challenge white supremacy are not hoping for the marginalization of white people. We're not hoping for injury to come to white people. We're not collaborating with a system of anti-white oppression. In fact, what we're trying to do is eradicate all forms of race-based oppression in the name of justice and equality. So it's fundamentally different. And what makes it sad is that when someone doesn't see that, or when they believe that challenging white supremacy is equal to challenging white people as good people, or that it's, that trying to break down whiteness is the same thing as trying to harm white people, it really shows me that there's a fundamental category error here, right? White people have come to the belief that whiteness is this organic, real thing. And the basis of my argument, and the argument of all anti-racist educators and activists, is that whiteness is a fraud. It was a category created for the purpose of maintaining inequality. So to break down white supremacy is not about attacking white people. It's not anti-white. It's anti-whiteness. Whiteness is a thing that didn't exist culturally, historically, politically, linguistically, sociologically, anthropologically, until the colonies of what became the United States. European people didn't think of themselves as members of one big white team. We spent most of our lives killing each other. European people spent most of their time hunting down other European people and trying to figure out who the witch was. That was sort of what we did for fun. That was our pastime, was hurting one another until we figured out it was easier to hurt other people. So we weren't one big team. And I think that for so-called white people to believe that really means something is incredibly sad. Something James Baldwin said many years ago. He said, talking to white people, he said, as long as you think that you're white, there's no hope for you. And I think that's very true. As long as white people actually cling to whiteness, we can't be, we can't be American. We can't be human. You sacrifice your humanity on the altar of this thing that only exists as a category meant to demarcate the lines of who has and who doesn't have. And so when white people get that confused with a personal attack on them as people, it goes to show that too many of us have internalized the idea of whiteness as an actual organic identity, and that's somewhat pathetic.
Well, that's a great answer, Tim. This is Frank. I'm gonna jump in here, and I have a question relating to that exact answer you gave, which is, I know you give a lot of anti-racism, your just talks and speeches. I watched your documentary White Like Me, and I see that you do a lot of that. How many people, white people, say after you give a speech or a talk, come up to you and say, you know what, I totally get it now. The blinders are off. How can I get started being, changing things? Because I was totally blind to the whiteness that I had, basically inherited through white privilege. What kind of percentage do you really have of people that turn around and change their hearts after hearing you speak?
Well, it's hard to know, right? But obviously, very few people are going to do that in the immediate aftermath of any talk. I mean, I'm a pretty good speaker, but I ain't that good. I don't think anybody can give a talk and have somebody go. In fact, I'd be worried, to be honest with you. I'd be incredibly nervous about anyone who came up to me right after hearing a speech and said, "Oh my God, now I get it," because that's the kind of person that, a week later, they're going to hear a speech by somebody else saying the exact opposite thing, and it's going to be a good speech, and they're going to go, "Oh my God, now I totally get that." I'd rather people sit with the discomfort that is caused. And I know that I cause some discomfort in the audience. You can see the body language, but you can also see an interesting response. I think I certainly get comments, not usually in the immediate aftermath, but emails, where people who I hear from years after the fact, who talk about how either something I wrote or something that I said in a media thing or a speech, and not just me, by the way, me and other white anti-racist and other folks of color, because I'm real insistent that when white folks hear me, it's not enough to stay with me. You can't just immerse yourself in Tim Wise and a handful of other white educators. You've got to go to the source of the wisdom, which is fundamentally black and brown. So I try to turn people on to black and brown authors and educators and activists. And I do hear back, from white folks and hundreds, I mean, really quite probably over the years, thousands of people from whom I've heard who said, "Listen, this really sort of set me on a fundamentally different path in life." And I don't want to take credit for that because, like I said, it's not just me. It's a combination of people, a combination of arguments. I think it's starting to happen more now because of social media. I've been doing this on the road for 23 years. And at the beginning, we didn't even have the internet. So clearly the impact then would have been quite a bit more limited. But I think now, like was said at the outset, that one video that has 14 million views, which is just insane. 14 million views on that one particular clip. It's a 3 to 4 minute clip of a larger 40-minute speech. That one clip being seen 14 or 15 million times, and you put all the clips together, it's well over 25 million clips. That's pretty powerful, not just for me, but for other folks. If you can get the word out that way, you never know who it's going to influence. Now, at the same time, I'm not going to pretend that I don't get a lot of really not so friendly, responses too. I mean, I have a file that I keep that's filled with hate mail and threats and things like that. And then right next to it is a file of well wishes and people who did, in fact, decide to change their study, their academic study, their career choices, how they raise their kids. I mean, so I've got sort of a good file and a bad file. And luckily, the good file is much bigger than the bad file. So I think it's making an impact. But I think right now, and this is the key for anyone who hears this, is that we have the capacity now, not just me, but all of us, we have the capacity through things like this podcast, through social media, through, all these different channels that we just didn't have even 10 or 15 years ago, to really spread alternative narratives of the world, how it is, how it has been, and how it could be. And I think that's an incredibly important tool so that we could begin to see a real exponential increase in the impact, even though, let's say, for the last 20 years, it's been rather slow. And you can see this right now. I mean, in the last 3 years, there has been, ever since the outgrowth of the Black Lives Matter movement, or the larger movement for Black lives encompassing many different groups, there has also been a parallel growth in the number of white ally anti-racist solidarity groups, particularly SURJ, showing up for racial justice, SURJ, over 100 chapters around the country involving literally tens of thousands of white folks, now some more active than others, but tens of thousands of white folks across the country who in the last 3 years have been acting in solidarity with the movement for Black lives. And the unfortunate thing is that while you got tens of thousands of white folks out there doing this anti-racism work, they're getting almost no media coverage. While the white nationalist, so-called alt-right neo-Nazi movement that got a lot of attention surrounding the election of Donald Trump gets coverage every day. They had a conference in D.C. after the election that brought 300 people, 300 white nationalists show up to this thing, and it's front page news for a week. Yep. 300 white nationalists show up to this thing, and it's on every news channel. You got thousands of white folks out all across this country doing work for police accountability, actually going into white neighborhoods, knocking on doors, talking to other white people on their porch about racism in the justice system. Now, you would think that that might be a news story, and yet the media doesn't want to talk about that. They want to talk about, white nationalism, which, look, we got to pay attention to it. We got to worry about it. But there's also this parallel thing happening, and I think that deserves some attention as well.
Yeah, that's great. So another point I wanted to bring up with you was you we talked about Uncle Tom's a little bit earlier in the conversation. How many black people come up to you, say maybe email or even after you give them a speech, and they say, hey, you know what? It's all good, man. I made it on my own. We just need to stop the black on black crime and we'll be fine. We can make it. Like, do you have negative response from African Americans?
Well, I mean, that narrative is always out there, of course. That strain of thought within the black community has always existed. And so, sure, you hear some of that. I think what I hear more in terms of critique from the black community, and I totally understand it, I sympathize with it, I get it entirely, is much different than that. It's not the, oh, everything's cool, we just got to fix our own problems and white people are great and white supremacy is a myth. It's not that. What I often hear is a much more, I think, a much deeper critique, which is more along the lines of, a certain skepticism, right, towards me as a white person doing this work, talking about this stuff. And I totally understand that. If I were a person of color, I would not assume that any white person who spoke up about racism was necessarily genuine until I got to know them and really, watch them for a long time, because, white folks have black and brown folks have been burned by white folks plenty. So what I'm more likely to get as a critique from black and brown folks is the pushback that is rooted in the reality that they can look and they can see that people like me get a lot more attention, frankly, than a lot of amazing black and brown activists and educators, scholars and artists who do incredible work, who write books that are every bit as good or better, write essays that are every bit as good or better, are equally good or better as speakers, and maybe don't get, the number of speaking engagements that I get, or they don't get the book contracts, or they don't get as many eyeballs on their YouTube videos. Now, that's not true for all people of color. Obviously, there are a lot of folks of color who do. In fact, if you were to make a list of the 20 most prominent, spokespersons, educators, activists, or public intellectuals that talk about race, they're almost all going to be people of color. I might be the only white person on that list, and that's probably as it should be. It should be overwhelmingly people of color, but I can still understand how a person of color might look askance at a white person doing this work, because the reality, and I've talked about it, and I'm very upfront about this, is that as a white person doing the work, I do have a certain amount of privilege. Even though I'm fighting privilege, I still receive privilege. I am taken more seriously, particularly by white people, right, than I would be if I were a person of color. A person of color can give the same talk that I give, can write the same book, can write the same essay, can tweet the same tweet, and the reaction will be very, very different. And so my task is to try to be, number one, honest about that. Number two, accountable for what that means, which again is why I go back to what I said earlier about trying to steer folks away from just reading my work and making sure that they're also, engaging the work and the wisdom of people of color, because to me, that's really the source of anti-racist wisdom in this culture.
That's a great answer. So one of the last things that I want to ask you is, at the end of White Like Me, the documentary, you say, hey, we've got to, show, as you mentioned, more white people who are actually doing the activism, and also call out this coded language, this coded words, because I can't remember the gentleman's name who, was saying, hey, you can't say the N-word, but you can say these things. You can say states' rights. You can say, taking your country back. The funny thing that I see in the media now is, okay, everybody knows if somebody gets recorded, say, using the N-word or using some racial slurs, they're going to be, fired. They're going to have to resign, like, immediately, right? That's just how things go. Remember the Donald Sterling thing? He gets fired. But yet, Donald Sterling discriminated against African American and Hispanics for years in his housing, right? But it wasn't until they got a salacious clip of him using the N-word and saying nefarious things about black people. So how do we change the narrative for these code words so that they're just as, how would you say, venomous? They're viewed just as venomously as the obvious words like the N-word and other things. I mean, what is the real way to educate people to say, hey, you know what? They're saying these same things that they would say in the 50s and 60s, except they just dressed it up a little bit.
Right. Well, I mean, there are two things, somewhat separate, also related. One is the issue of coded language, or what Ian Haney Lopez calls dog whistle politics. Obviously, in the clip you mentioned in White Like Me is a really revealing clip. It's actually, I think, maybe the most important part of the documentary. And it's a clip from 1981. It's a recording of Lee Atwater, who was, until his death in the late 80s, maybe 91. It was late 80s or early 90s. was up until that time, he was like the number one Republican political consultant. He was the Karl Rove of his day. He was the guy. He worked with Reagan. He worked with all the main conservative politicians. And what he was saying in that interview, in a moment of candor, right, was, back in the 50s, you could use the N word. Of course, he actually said the word. I won't, but he did. And he said, you could say it in the 50s, but then by 1968, you can't say it anymore. It's not, you're going to get in trouble. So you gotta change it. You got to say states' rights. You got to talk about crime. You got to talk about taxes. And then he goes on to explain that the real purpose of that, and he had done this himself. He wasn't calling out other people. He was saying, this is what we did. This is what I've done. That he was saying he did this, that this is what his team did, was using the language, but knowing that, that at the end of the day, black folks would still be the ones who got hurt the most, that states' rights or talking about low taxes and small government was going to result in cuts for programs that, disproportionately benefited folks of color. So it was a way to do racial damage without seeming to be racist. So number one, the way that we get people to understand the similarity between overt racial slurs and dog whistle politics is to point out that it was a deliberate strategy. It's not just us on the left who were saying, oh, when you say that, you mean race. No, it's their own people who have admitted this. It's their own people who acknowledge that when Ronald Reagan talked about welfare queens and designer jeans driving Cadillacs to the welfare office and used Linda Taylor, a woman of color, as his operative example, he was trying to paint a picture for white America. When he said in 1976, the first time he ran for president, and didn't get the nomination, when he ran in 76 and said that strapping young bucks were buying T-bone steaks at the grocery with food stamps, he was trying to paint a picture. It was a deliberate strategy. That doesn't mean that everybody who ever critiques a social welfare program is necessarily a racist in the sense that we're used to using that word. But it does mean that the language itself paints a picture, creates an image, and has a racist effect. The second issue related to that, and I think it's actually more important even than the dog whistle politics, and you sort of alluded to it in the setup to my answer here in your question, was, the problem with a lot of the folks who are caught on tape using racial slurs, whether it's Donald Sterling or whoever it might be, is not just that they use certain language or that they think about people in a particular way, whether they use the N-word or whether they use the sort of the more modern variation of it, which I guess the modern iteration is to use the word thug to refer to black folks, right? That's sort of the modern way of saying the N-word without saying it. But the real issue is what you alluded to, Donald Sterling's history with regard to housing discrimination, with regard to actual, active institutional discrimination. Same thing with Donald Trump, right? The issue with Donald Trump, I don't know if Donald Trump has ever used the N-word or not. I know that, there's this rumor that there are these tapes out there that were sort of off-camera apprentice tapes, and Tom Arnold says he has them and he's going to release them. I don't know if that's true or not. But what I do know is the Justice Department found him and his daddy responsible for housing discrimination on two different occasions in what were at the time and still to this day are among the biggest settlements in the history of the department for housing discrimination. What I do know is that he stoked racial fears directly in the pages of the New York Times after the so-called Central Park jogger rape case, where he continued then and continues to this day to blame young men who we now know are not responsible for the crime, both because DNA evidence says they weren't and because the guy who actually did it later confessed to having done it. So that's the stuff that concerns me more. Did Donald Trump use all kinds of coded language? Yes. I would say, for instance, when he got up and said, black people live in hell. You can't walk down the street without getting shot. You have no education. You have no jobs. He tried to make that sound like he was being sympathetic. Really what he was doing, first of all, he was stereotyping the black community, because it just isn't true that most black people don't have jobs. It just isn't true that most black people don't have education. It just isn't true that black people get shot every time they walk down the street. I mean, the reality is crime in the black community, contrary to all the stuff we hear in media and from politicians, crime in the black community is actually down by 35 to 40% since the late 80s or early 90s. The homicide rate for black men in this country is actually lower today than it was in 1980. 1950. So now obviously there are outliers and there are issues in places like Chicago and others where they've had upticks in homicide. But overall, crime was worse in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was president. Crime was worse in the early 90s when George H.W. Bush was president. Crime was actually worse numerically in the mid 70s, right, when we had both Republicans and then Jimmy Carter as president. And in some communities was even worse in the 50s. So the reality says one thing. Donald Trump used that language, though, because he knows it paints a picture, right? If Donald Trump says black people live in hell, he reminds white people of how dysfunctional they already think black people are. He didn't do that to be kind and compassionate and show concern for black people. That was the mainstream media spin. Oh, he's trying to reach out and show that he cares. No, he's not. He's trying to look at white people and go, hey, you remember the inner city? It's a really dangerous place. We haven't even used that phrase inner city for like 20 years, right? But he resurrected this image of black decrepitude and black dysfunction and black pathology. That was coded language. But what concerns me more than the coded language, as bad as that is what he says he wants to do. In other words, the coded language is nothing compared to the fact that he advocated nationwide stop and frisk. Right? So you're advocating a policy of nationwide stop and frisk racial profiling. That concerns me way more than the rhetoric you use. You're proposing to build a wall to keep people from coming from Mexico. That concerns me more than the fact that you sat there eating a taco bowl at Trump Tower and saying, I love Hispanics. I mean, that's pretty clumsy and stupid. But the bigger issue is the systemic discrimination that he has announced he supports. That's not even the stuff he's hiding, right? The dog whistle stuff is subtle. That stuff about nationwide stop and frisk, a Muslim registry, and a wall on the southern border, that's not subtle. That is the heart of his campaign and the heart of his appeal.
Wow. That, man, I wish you would, I mean, that's the crazy thing. I wish everything you just said, how, I guess, I know I said the last question, but just the last thing is, how did that manage to just get by all the voters in this past election? Everything you just said, pretty much, a lot of, it was painfully obvious to me and Byron and probably people like yourself. But, I mean, how was it just cloaked? It just blows my mind, I guess.
Well, first off, let's be clear. It didn't get by most voters. Donald Trump lost by 3 million votes. So most people who went to the polls actually knew that he was lying, that he was a fraud, that he was playing upon racist bigotry, religious bigotry, and other forms of prejudice and bias. Most Americans who actually went to the polls rejected him. And he needs to be reminded of that every single time he opens his mouth, and his supporters need to be reminded of it every time they open theirs. The only reason he's president is because 75,000 people spread over 3 states happened to vote for him more than they voted for Hillary Clinton. In the state of Wisconsin, it was 12,000 people. In the state of Michigan, it was 20 or 30,000 people. In Pennsylvania, it was 40,000 or whatever. Those votes go differently, and we're having a very different conversation right now. The only reason that he's president is because we continue to operate on the basis of an electoral college, which is an antiquated system put in place by the founders in large part, not entirely, but in large part, because slaveholding states didn't have a big enough voting population to feel that they had sufficient power. So if you had a direct election for president, which they didn't support either at the time, but if you had based the election on a popular vote, you would have to have enfranchised enslaved people in states like Virginia in order to have a sizable enough population. Well, they didn't want to do that. They didn't want black folks to vote. And a third of the population in Virginia, 50% in South Carolina, 40% in certain other southern states were enslaved persons who weren't going to be given the right to vote. And so as a result, they needed a system that picked electors based on something other than a direct actual popular vote. So in part, the Electoral College is there as a giveaway to white supremacy. And here we are 200 and, however many years, 240 years later, and we are still burdened with the vestiges of that system, which is, again, one more very good reason why when white people say, why can't we just get over slavery? Well, because it just picked your president. That's why. It just picked your president. And for every white person who doesn't understand, every white liberal who doesn't like Donald Trump, every white non-liberal who doesn't like Donald Trump, you want to understand why we can't stop talking about slavery. It is because a system of slavery was implicated in why we have an electoral college. So slavery as a system just put Donald Trump in the White House 240 years after the Electoral College was founded and 150 years after slavery was abolished. So go figure.
We are talking to Tim Wise, author, anti-racist activist. You can visit timwise.org for more information. We really appreciate your time, and we're going to be greedy with it. I'm going to try to sneak in 2 more questions with you if you have time. And the first is to piggyback on that answer on how Frank mentioned that, how did some of that coded language get past so many people? I heard you speak about the law of 12s, and I wonder if you could explain that to the audience, how it's used in advertising when most companies feel like if they can get a particular commercial out there, I believe it's 12 times, that they will have that consumer hooked in. And a lot of times from the conservative right, you repeat something enough, you stated how there's reality versus what people think and how the numbers don't match. But if you repeat something enough that, hey, black people are all on welfare, they're all criminals and thugs, people will believe it. Could you explain that to our audience on the whole law of 12?
Sure. Well, many years ago, I had a friend who was in advertising, and he was telling me there's this thing called either the rule of 11 or the rule of 12. And I can't remember which it was, but we'll just go with rule of 12 for the sake of argument. And what he was saying was it's this idea that companies have that the more times you see an ad, obviously, the more likely you'll be to buy a product. And what the marketing research was showing was that after about a dozen times of seeing an ad for a particular consumer product, that is the point where you begin to see significant gains in sales. So, the first 5 or 6 times that you see that ad for, whatever product, the first couple times might be so abstract that you don't even really know what the product is. And if you're like me, I've had that experience where the ad comes on and it's really slick, but it's almost too slick, and you don't even know what the hell they're trying to sell you, right? So you're sitting there and you're going, what was that? Was that toothpaste? What is that? And on the one hand, you sit there and you think to yourself, well, that was a really stupid ad buy because I don't even know what they're selling. But they're not idiots. They know exactly what they're doing. They know that by the 5th or 6th time that ad comes on, you're going to pay extra special attention because the first 4 times you were like, I don't know what that was. By the time you get to 12, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I got to go get a Taco Bell Crunch Wrap. Now, you didn't want the damn Taco Bell Crunch Wrap, but you saw the ad 12 times and you're like, not only do I want it at breakfast, right? I want it at 6 o'clock in the morning. I need to have a taco wrapped up in a burrito with an egg and a piece of sausage in it at 5:30. You didn't want that last year. You didn't want that 5 years ago. Some fool at Taco Bell was like, watch what I can make them buy. And create this demand, right? Now, if they can make you buy a Taco Bell Crunch Wrap at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, they can make you switch toothpaste, toilet paper, tennis shoes, smartphone, tablet brand. If they can make you, go from one rental car company to another rental car company just because you saw an ad 12 times or a really good one during the Super Bowl, how much easier do you figure it would be to make you buy into a racial stereotype, religious stereotype, sexual stereotype, gender stereotype, economic or class stereotype? Because we've been seeing that ad, so to speak, metaphorically speaking. We've been seeing that advertisement since we were children. We've seen it way more than 12 times. And so even good people who are not, and I think most people are good people, even people who are not, sort of intrinsically biased, overtly biased, can still fall prey to those stereotypes, just like you and I can go to the grocery. They always tell you, go to the grocery, don't go hungry, right? And the reason they tell you not to go to the grocery hungry is because you will then buy stuff you don't need. You'll get up to the checkout. You'll be like, damn, I need a Snickers bar. You don't need a Snickers bar. You just think you don't need beef jerky, whatever they got up at the front like that. You didn't need that. You didn't go to the store for that. That wasn't even on your list. Right. But now it's an impulse purchase because you've been conditioned to think that you need the Snickers. Oh, and I need the People magazine and I need the National Enquirer or whatever the heck they got up there. Right. And so the truth is you can be conditioned even against your normal impulse. Now, the good news, and there is some good news, is that if you can be conditioned against your interest and against your normal way of thinking, you can also counter condition, right? You can train yourself to think different. So just like with the grocery example, I can force myself to think when I go to the grocery, right? I can consciously go to the grocery and say, all right, I'm thinking about this. I'm not going to buy the snack food that I don't really want and isn't good for me. I'm not going to buy the Snickers up at the front counter. I'm going to eat before I go to the grocery so I don't over purchase, right? You can take steps to condition against your conditioning, but you can't do that unless you realize you have been conditioned. So the first order of business is to acknowledge the number that's being run on you. by a society that has encouraged us all to buy into racial stereotypes, religious stereotypes, class and gender stereotypes, sexual stereotypes. The minute that you start to own that you've been played by that is the minute that you can get free from it. The problem is we don't want to admit that we've been played.
One final question I have for you. And I admit that most of the questions I've asked you, I've heard most of your answer or some of the answer before, but I definitely wanted you to share it with the audience. This question I have not heard asked to you. You may have answered it, but I haven't heard it yet.
Okay.
And black people are very divided on this question because we've had folks on here like Quentin Brooker and others who are on one side. In your opinion, did Barack Obama, as a two-term president, did he do enough for black people as far as advancing their economic status and everything else that would help them in this country? Did he do enough in your opinion, or could he have done a whole lot more?
Well, of course he did not do enough. And that would be the answer that I expect I would give with any person chosen to be president of the empire. You know, I don't expect that anyone chosen to be the president of the American empire, so long as it remains a far-flung political, military, and economic empire, is ever going to be able to do enough for marginalized populations, be they of color, be they gender minorities in terms of power, be they sexual minorities, religious minorities, because the empire has certain, a capitalist militaristic system has certain assumptions built into it. So no, he didn't do enough. And now, did he do more than John McCain would have done? Yes, I think it is fair to say the answer to that is yes. Did he do more than Mitt Romney would have done? I think the answer to that is yes. Did he do more than Donald Trump is going to do? I think that's inarguably the case. So there are always two issues, right? Number one is, are we satisfied? And the answer to that has to be no. I think if we get satisfied with the idea that having a black or brown face in a high place is sufficient for the cause of liberation, we're lost. Obviously, the task is eradicating white supremacy, and that's going to be something that we collectively do. No president can do that. No head of the empire can do that. That won't happen until the empire is no longer. And I don't mean to, I'm not talking about like overthrowing and smashing the system in some violent uprising. I'm talking about until the United States becomes a nation among nations and doesn't try to control and dictate world affairs in the way that we do, that then leads us into wars that are not at all about self-defense, that are really about protecting the economic and political interest of a very narrow band of elites. I don't expect that any president, no matter how well-intended they are, will really be able to get away from the kinds of policies that continue to marginalize black and brown peoples all around the globe. Will some be better than others? Yes. And that's the second point, which is even though nobody can do the job as well as we'd like them to do it, it still does matter at the margins who is elected. I would never want to encourage the cynicism that says, oh, well, Barack Obama failed black folks and therefore why did we even vote for him? I mean, things can always be worse. They really can. And I think we're about to potentially see the truth of that statement. I would be very surprised if we don't. For those who don't think Barack Obama accomplished anything, wait about 6 months and get back, because I think we're about to see how wrong that was. On the other hand, for those who think Barack Obama did enough, wait around 6 months, because if he'd really done enough, Donald Trump couldn't undo it. If he'd really done enough, Republican Congress couldn't undo it. If he'd really done enough, the Democratic Party, as inadequate as they are, wouldn't have lost ground all around the country over the last several years. We didn't grow any more people like him in the sense of people who could inspire voters. And so I think the Democratic Party has a lot of soul searching to do. I think progressives have a lot of soul searching to do. And I think we all have to make a differentiation between what we do on election day, whether it's in 2008 or 2016, and what we do 364 days out of the year when it's not election day, because I think a lot of people put so much faith in Barack Obama that they just figured, oh, he's in there now, we got this. Everybody was talking about it's post-racial. And of course, that was mostly white folks that said that, but there were people of color too who went to sleep for a minute.
Oh, yes.
And felt like, oh, things are good. Now, the good news is last 3 years, young black and brown folks have been leading the charge to say, yeah, we're not satisfied with that. There's a reason that Black Lives Matter emerges and gets as much accomplished narratively in this administration. I'm not sure that would have happened under another administration. I'm not trying to give Barack Obama credit for it, but I'm saying I think it's important to have black-led movements challenging black leadership. even when it's ostensibly progressive black leadership. That's really valuable. So I think there's been some amazing black political activism in the last several years. But the fact is, for the first 5 years of the Obama administration, a lot of that was not happening in the same way. And thankfully, that started to change. But I think for the first 5 years, the same thing with Bill Clinton. You know, for almost the entire Clinton administration, you had a lot of progressive folks that just went to sleep because they were like, oh, you know, Bill's in there, he'll handle it. And he reads the same magazines we read and he's cool. And then look what happened, right? So we've got to realize what we do on election day. Yeah, it's important, but ultimately it's harm reduction. It's like giving out clean needles to heroin addicts in the park. I support giving clean needles to heroin addicts because I think it cuts down on hepatitis, cuts down on HIV transmission. It saves lives, but it doesn't get anybody off heroin, right? So at the end of the day, you give out needles to addicts to save their lives because it's better than the alternative, but you still got to deal with what? You got to deal with heroin education. You got to deal with rehab. You got to deal with providing the healthcare resources, the counseling resources. Same thing is true here. Elections are important as harm reduction, but the real important thing is what are we doing the other 364 days out of the year? That's what matters.
Tim Wise, anti-racist activist, author. Again, you can visit timwise.org for more information. Also, you can follow him on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise. You mentioned the whole 6-month thing. I was wondering if you're available, can we have you back on? Because that's how they judge presidents, by those first 6 months.
Yeah.
If you're available, will you come back on and we'll see exactly what Trump has done?
Anytime. Absolutely. I would love to do it. All
right. Well, we thank you for your time. Many of our listeners, they're the ones that have shared your videos many, many times on social media. So
I appreciate that.
I'm sure they enjoyed this, and we can't thank you enough for coming on, sir. Thank you.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Be good.